14 megastars who scrub toilets to survive. #5 will leave you speechless. Behind the blinding flashbulbs of the paparazzi, the multi-million-dollar mansions, and the globally recognized faces lies a deeply humbling, gritty reality that Hollywood actively tries to conceal. We are constantly sold the glittering illusion of overnight success, assuming our favorite global icons were simply born destined for the silver screen or sold-out stadiums. But the shocking truth is entirely different. Before the fame, the power, and the unimaginable wealth, some of the most influential figures on the planet were literally scrubbing floors, unclogging toilets, and wiping up after the rest of society. Their hands were calloused by harsh cleaning chemicals, not pampered by elite stylists. Today, we are tearing down the celebrity myth to reveal the documented, grueling histories of 14 superstars who survived the absolute bottom of the labor pool as janitors and cleaners. These are historically verified facts that prove greatness is often forged in the most degrading environments. Are you ready to see the true cost of chasing a dream? Make sure to subscribe to the archive to follow along, uncover more hidden historical secrets, and support our journey into the untold stories of the elite. The real path to stardom begins with a mop in hand. Stephen King. Long before he was globally recognized as the undisputed master of horror and a staggeringly wealthy literary icon, Stephen King lived a life defined by desperate, suffocating poverty. Following his graduation from the University of Maine, King could not secure a stable teaching position, forcing him and his wife Tabitha to live in a cramped, freezing double-wide trailer. To keep his family from starving and to barely cover their meager utility bills, King took a grueling, soul-crushing job as a high school janitor at Brunswick High School. He spent his days in the absolute trenches of manual labor, scrubbing scuffed hallway floors, emptying overflowing trash cans, and unclogging deeply unsanitary high school toilets. The physical and emotional degradation of cleaning up after disrespectful teenagers was incredibly heavy. Yet King used this gritty environment as literal fuel for his imagination. It was during one of his miserable shifts, while aggressively scrubbing the walls of the girls' locker room shower, that he noticed a metal feminine hygiene dispenser. That single, mundane janitorial observation sparked a dark psychological idea about teenage isolation, bullying, and telekinesis. He went home and began typing the manuscript for Carrie. Frustrated by his lack of progress and his depressing reality, King actually threw the early draft into the trash. It was Tabitha who fished the crumpled papers out of the garbage, urging him to finish it. That janitor's trash-bound manuscript eventually sold for a massive paperback advance, permanently ending his days of scrubbing high school showers and launching the greatest career in modern horror history. Sylvester Stallone. The cinematic legend of Rocky is universally celebrated as the ultimate underdog story. But Sylvester Stallone's real-life trajectory is far more brutal and deeply humiliating than any fictional Hollywood script. Before he was an internationally recognized action megastar, commanding millions per film, Stallone was a desperately broke, starving actor living in a tiny, dilapidated apartment in New York City. At his absolute lowest point, he was so financially destitute that he famously had to sell his beloved dog Butkus to a stranger outside a liquor store for $50 simply to afford food. To survive this brutal period, Stallone took a series of bizarre, highly degrading odd jobs, the most notorious being a cage cleaner at the Central Park Zoo. His primary responsibility was shoveling massive amounts of raw, putrid lion dung out of the enclosures. He worked in an intensely dangerous, foul-smelling environment, constantly surrounded by the terrifying roars of wild animals while performing back-breaking manual labor for minimum wage. The intense physical exhaustion and sheer indignity of the job deeply influenced his psychological state, forging a raw, aggressive determination within him. He famously channeled that exact, desperate energy into a frantic, 3-day writing binge, producing the script for Rocky. When studios offered him hundreds of thousands of dollars for the script on the condition that he wouldn't star in it, the former lion cage cleaner stubbornly refused. He had survived the absolute filth of the zoo, and he was willing to bet his entire life on his own potential, ultimately winning an Oscar and building a billion-dollar franchise. Eminem. Born Marshall Bruce Mathers III, Eminem is undisputedly one of the most successful and culturally dominant musical artists in history, boasting a net worth of hundreds of millions. Yet, his origin story is one of the most brutal, deeply traumatic rags-to-riches journeys in modern entertainment. Abandoned by his father when he was just 6 months old, Marshall grew up in extreme, grinding poverty, constantly moving between precarious public housing units in Missouri and Detroit. His mother struggled severely with substance abuse, resulting in a deeply unstable home life where eviction notices were a daily reality. Living as a white teenager in a predominantly black, highly violent Detroit neighborhood, he was subjected to horrific bullying. The abuse peaked when a school bully beat the 9-year-old Mathers so severely that he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and was placed in a medically induced coma for over a week, teetering on the edge of death. Dropping out of high school at age 17, he worked grueling minimum wage jobs as a short-order cook and dishwasher to support his young daughter, Haley, living in a rat-infested mobile home that was frequently targeted by drive-by shootings. He spent hours violently scrubbing grease-caked pots and pans, a degrading form of sanitation labor that perfectly mirrored the filth of his living conditions. Rap became his only psychological escape, a raw, unfiltered outlet for his immense rage and depression. After traveling to the 1997 Rap Olympics in Los Angeles with barely enough money for a plane ticket and getting evicted the day before he left, his demo tape miraculously landed in the hands of Dr. Dre. The boy who was beaten into a coma and left to rot in a trailer park weaponized his trauma to become a literal rap god. Mick Jagger. As the wildly charismatic, endlessly energetic frontman of the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger is the absolute embodiment of elite rock and roll excess, commanding global stadium tours and a staggering personal fortune. However, long before he was strutting across stages in dazzling, custom-tailored outfits and dominating the music charts, Jagger was subjected to the grim, intensely sobering reality of physical labor. While studying as a young undergraduate at the London School of Economics, he desperately needed a way to fund his education and his burgeoning passion for underground blues music. To make ends meet, he secured a part-time job working as a porter and cleaner at the Bexley Psychiatric Hospital in London. This was not a glamorous or lighthearted gig. It was an incredibly heavy, psychologically taxing environment. Jagger was tasked with performing heavy manual labor, hauling supplies, cleaning up after deeply unwell patients, and navigating the bleak, institutionalized halls of a 1960s mental health facility. The stark, incredibly depressing reality of the psychiatric hospital stood in massive contrast to the vibrant, explosive counterculture rebellion he was secretly brewing with Keith Richards. He carried the weight of that grim, sterile environment with him, ensuring that once he grabbed a microphone, he would unleash an unparalleled chaotic energy that completely defied the rigid, sterile structures of the society he once had to physically clean up after. His transition from mopping hospital floors to becoming a global cultural phenomenon proves that raw ambition cannot be contained by bleak beginnings. Jim Carrey. With a rubbery face and boundless chaotic energy, Jim Carrey became the highest-paid comedic actor of the 1990s. commanding an unprecedented $20 million per film. However, the manic humor that made him a billionaire box office draw was forged in the dark depths of severe childhood poverty and depression. Growing up in Canada, Carey's life completely unraveled when he was 12 years old. His father, an accountant and the family's sole provider, suddenly lost his job. The financial devastation was absolute. The family lost their home and was forced to live entirely out of a cramped Volkswagen camper van parked in various lots across Canada. To survive, a teenage Carey and his siblings took grueling jobs as security guards and janitors at a local factory. Carey worked brutal 8-hour shifts scrubbing toilets and sweeping floors immediately after attending a full day of high school, a punishing routine that filled him with intense, blinding rage and ultimately forced him to drop out of school entirely at age 16. During his darkest moments, staring out the window of a rusty van, comedy became his only psychological defense mechanism, a way to make his severely depressed, bedridden mother smile. In 1985, completely broke and struggling to make a name for himself in Los Angeles, Carey famously drove his beat-up Toyota to the Hollywood Hills, looked out over the city, and wrote himself a fake check for $10 million for acting services rendered. He dated it for Thanksgiving 1995, eventually landing Dumb and Dumber right on time, proving his childhood desperation was the ultimate catalyst for his historic success. Jon Bon Jovi. Before he was selling out massive global stadiums, defining the epic sound of 1980s arena rock, and cementing his status as a legendary cultural icon, Jon Bon Jovi was literally sweeping the floors beneath the feet of his musical heroes. In his late teens, completely determined to break into the notoriously difficult music industry, he took a job as a janitor and general errand boy at the legendary Power Station recording studios in New York City. The studio happened to be co-owned by his cousin, Tony Bon Jovi, but this familial connection did not grant him any glamorous privileges. Instead, Jon spent his days pushing a heavy broom, emptying ashtrays, fetching coffee, and scrubbing the studio floors. However, this highly menial labor placed him in the exact epicenter of musical greatness. While he was emptying trash cans, he quietly observed massive legends like David Bowie, Queen, and the Rolling Stones as they recorded their historic albums. He absorbed their highly disciplined work ethic and studio techniques. Crucially, he utilized his janitorial access to his absolute advantage. When the massive studio was completely empty and locked down during the extremely late-night hours, Jon would sneak in and record his own original demo tapes alongside whatever professional session musicians happened to be lingering around. It was during these secret, off-hour sessions, sweaty from a day of mopping, that he recorded the original breakout track Runaway. The boy who cleaned the studio ultimately built an empire large enough to buy it. Kurt Cobain. As the intensely reluctant voice of an entire generation and the brilliant frontman of Nirvana, Kurt Cobain completely revolutionized global music, shifting the entire cultural landscape away from polished pop toward raw, unfiltered grunge. Yet the deep, agonizing angst that fueled his legendary songwriting was heavily rooted in his own intensely difficult, working-class reality. Following his parents' deeply traumatic divorce, Cobain became a highly rebellious, alienated teenager, eventually dropping out of high school completely. To support himself while trying to form a band in the dreary logging town of Aberdeen, Washington, Cobain took a series of menial jobs, including working as a janitor at a local IMCA and, astonishingly, at Weatherwax High School, the exact same institution he had just dropped out of. He spent his days in incredibly dirty, paint-stained coveralls, actively scrubbing the scuffed floors, unclogging toilets, and washing the windows of the school, while the same peers who had brutally mocked and bullied him walked right past him. The psychological humiliation of cleaning up after the very people who ostracized him deeply amplified his profound sense of social alienation. Ironically, this exact experience heavily influenced Nirvana's most iconic visual moment. In the legendary music video for Smells Like Teen Spirit, a dancing janitor prominently features in the chaotic high school gymnasium scene, a brilliant, highly subversive inside joke referencing Cobain's own gritty, floor-mopping past. He successfully channeled the grime and humiliation of his janitorial days into a sonic explosion that permanently altered the history of rock music. Jennifer Aniston. Today, Jennifer Aniston is universally recognized as television royalty, a massively successful global superstar whose iconic role as Rachel Green on Friends secured her unprecedented million-per-episode contracts. She represents the absolute pinnacle of polished, effortless Hollywood glamour. However, her journey to immense fame was completely devoid of that glamorous ease. Before landing her historic television role, Aniston endured years of agonizing rejection in New York and Los Angeles, desperately trying to survive in a highly expensive city. To keep a roof over her head and fund her endless string of failed auditions, she took on an exhausting variety of minimum-wage survival jobs. She worked as a highly stressed telemarketer, apologizing to angry people over the phone, and as a struggling waitress. But her most humbling reality was working as a professional domestic maid. Aniston spent her days traveling to the homes of wealthy strangers, scrubbing their dirty toilets, vacuuming their carpets, and cleaning their heavily soiled bathrooms. She was completely invisible, performing the grueling, unsanitary sanitation labor that the elite actively refused to do themselves. The massive psychological contrast between staring into a dirty toilet bowl and dreaming of massive cinematic success required an unbreakable mental resilience. She refused to let the incredibly degrading nature of her day job crush her artistic spirit. Her eventual breakthrough completely erased her financial struggles, but the immense humility and grounded perspective she gained from scrubbing strangers' floors remains a core part of her fiercely unpretentious public persona. Steve Harvey. As the incredibly charismatic host of Family Feud, a massively successful author, and a powerful media mogul, Steve Harvey commands a massive, multi-million-dollar entertainment empire. He is famous for his impeccably tailored, custom suits and his booming, confident laughter. But behind the bright studio lights is a dark history of extreme struggle, homelessness, and grueling physical labor. In the late 1980s, when Harvey made the incredibly risky decision to quit his stable insurance sales job to pursue stand-up comedy full-time, his life completely collapsed. The comedy gigs paid practically nothing, leading to a devastating divorce and total financial ruin. To survive the brutal years of grinding through small, heavily hostile comedy clubs, Harvey took a job as a professional carpet cleaner. This was not light work. It involved dragging incredibly heavy, waterlogged industrial cleaning machines up endless flights of stairs into strangers' apartments, performing back-breaking physical labor for minimal cash. He was so completely destitute during this period that he was entirely homeless for 3 agonizing years, secretly living out of his battered 1976 Ford Tempo. He would wash himself in gas station bathrooms and hotel swimming pool showers before heading to his carpet cleaning shifts, completely hiding his desperation from his clients and his comedy audiences. The sheer, exhausting grit required to clean filthy carpets all day while trying to make hostile crowds laugh at night forged an unbreakable, relentless hustle within Harvey, proving that his current empire was built on a foundation of absolute, undeniable survival. Shania Twain. Globally reigning as the undisputed queen of country pop and holding the record for the best-selling studio album by a female artist in history, Shania Twain projects an image of absolute, sparkling empowerment. Yet, her early life in the freezing, isolated town of Timmins, Ontario, was completely defined by extreme poverty, domestic violence, and a heartbreaking level of manual labor. Her family was frequently so poor that they regularly relied on local food banks, and she would often go to school with simply mustard on bread for lunch. The tragedy of her youth completely peaked when both her mother and stepfather were killed in a devastating car crash, suddenly leaving a 21-year-old Twain as the sole legal guardian and provider for her 3 younger siblings. To keep her deeply traumatized family together and prevent them from being completely separated by the foster care system, she had to accept any work available. She took incredibly harsh jobs in the local reforestation industry, swinging a heavy axe in the freezing wilderness. More crucially, she worked heavily as a domestic maid, scrubbing floors, cleaning filthy kitchens, and doing the grueling sanitation work in other people's homes to earn enough cash to pay the family's heating bills. She sacrificed her own youth, performing the most menial, invisible labor imaginable, entirely out of pure, unbreakable love for her siblings. Her eventual massive superstardom was not just a career victory. It was the ultimate, hard-won reward for a woman who literally cleaned up other people's dirt to keep her own family alive. Ashton Kutcher. Widely known for his massive success as a Hollywood leading man, a television superstar, and an incredibly savvy, billionaire-tier tech investor in Silicon Valley, Ashton Kutcher currently operates at the absolute highest levels of global wealth and influence. However, his incredibly polished, elite status entirely masks his incredibly gritty, blue-collar origins in rural Iowa. Growing up in a fiercely hardworking, lower-middle-class family, Kutcher fundamentally understood that if he wanted to escape his small town and attend college, he had to fund it himself. He took on heavily exhausting, deeply unglamorous factory work to survive. His most notorious job was at a massive, incredibly loud General Mills cereal production plant. He was not a high-level manager. His absolute sole responsibility was functioning as a floor sweeper. He spent hours upon hours, day after exhausting day, simply sweeping up massive, unending piles of highly sugary cereal dust that coated the entire factory floor. The sheer, mind-numbing monotony and intense physical repetition of the job were completely suffocating. He would leave his shifts completely covered in a sticky, sweet grime, utterly exhausted. Yet, Kutcher utilized the sheer boredom of the factory floor to aggressively plan his escape, developing an intense, relentless drive to succeed in something bigger. The extreme discipline required to execute such a deeply mindless, physically draining cleaning task ultimately provided him with the unshakable work ethic necessary to conquer both the vicious Hollywood casting system and the highly competitive tech investment world. Bernie Mac. Before his deeply tragic passing, Bernie Mac was universally revered as a true king of comedy, starring in massive Hollywood blockbusters and leading his own massively successful, critically acclaimed television sitcom. His comedy was incredibly fierce, entirely unapologetic, and deeply rooted in the harsh realities of the streets. This authenticity stemmed directly from the fact that he was a working-class survivor long before he ever picked up a microphone. Growing up in the notoriously tough, unforgiving neighborhoods of the South Side of Chicago, Mac spent over a decade grinding through incredibly tough, blue-collar labor just to put food on the table for his family, while aggressively trying to build his comedy career at night. For years, he worked full-time as a professional janitor and maintenance worker. He spent his days hauling massive bags of heavy garbage, aggressively mopping long institutional hallways, and physically repairing broken facilities. The heavy toll of this relentless, deeply unglamorous manual labor was immense, yet Mac completely refused to let the exhaustion defeat him. He would literally finish a deeply taxing shift of scrubbing floors, strip off his dirty work clothes, put on a sharp suit, and immediately head to heavily hostile, dangerous comedy clubs to perform. The intense grit, fearlessness, and absolute lack of pretension that defined his legendary comedic voice were literally forged on those dirty Chicago floors. He simply outworked everyone else, proving that a man who isn't afraid to clean toilets will never be afraid of a tough crowd.